The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching sun of August 1884, its red earth cracked and thirsting for rain that seemed as distant as mercy itself. In this unforgiving landscape, where survival depended on strength and the weak perished without ceremony, a young Apache woman named Aiyana moved like a shadow through the mesquite and sage, her dark eyes holding secrets that would have chilled the blood of any white settler who dared to look too deeply. Aiyana was 22 years old, though the hardships she had endured made her seem both ancient and timeless. Her name meant eternal, blossom in her native tongue, a cruel irony given that she had witnessed the systematic destruction of everything she had ever loved. She was the sole survivor of the massacre at Whispering Creek, an event that had occurred 3 years earlier but remained as vivid in her memory as if it had happened yesterday. The massacre had been the work of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a man whose hatred for the Apache people was matched only by his ambition for military glory. On that terrible morning in September 1881, Aiyana had been gathering medicinal herbs near the creek when she heard the first gunshots echoing across the valley. By the time she reached her village, it was too late. The soldiers had already begun their systematic slaughter of her people, hidden behind a boulder. 17-year-old Aiyana had watched in horror as soldiers killed her mother, her father, her 2 younger brothers, and her grandmother. She had seen them burn the sacred lodge where her people had prayed for generations, had watched them steal the horses that represented her tribe's wealth and freedom, had witnessed them desecrate the burial grounds where her ancestors rested. What had carved the deepest wound in Aiyana's soul was not just the killing it was the laughter. The soldiers had laughed as they murdered children, had joked as they violated the sacred spaces of her people, had celebrated as they destroyed a way of life that had existed for countless generations. In that moment, crouched behind the boulder, with tears streaming down her face, Aiyana had made a vow that would define the next 3 years of her life. She would have her revenge, no matter the cost. The Apache language, rich in words for honor, courage, and survival, had no direct translation. For the English concept of forgiveness, to Aiyana's people, justice was a balance that had to be maintained. When someone took a life had to be taken in return. When someone destroyed a family, their family had to pay the price. It was not cruelty. It was the natural order of things, as inevitable as the sunrise. For 3 years, Aiyana had lived as a ghost, moving through the territory like a specter of vengeance. She had learned to track like her grandfather had taught her, to move silently like her mother had, shown her to kill efficiently like her father had trained her. She had become something that existed between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a weapon forged by grief and tempered by hatred. Her targets had been carefully chosen. She did not kill indiscriminately, as the soldiers had done, to her people. Instead, she hunted those who had participated in the massacre, tracking them down one by one with the patience of a mountain cat stalking its prey. In 3 years, she had killed 7 men, all of them soldiers who had been at Whispering Creek, all of them men who had laughed as her family died. The white settlers called her the ghost of the desert, telling stories around their campfires of an Apache woman who appeared without warning, killed without mercy, and vanished without a trace. The military had placed a bounty on her head, $500. Dead or alive, but no one had ever come close to capturing her. She was too smart, too fast, too driven by a purpose that gave her strength beyond her physical limitations. But on this particular August morning, as Aiyana crouched behind a ridge overlooking the Broken Arrow Ranch, she was preparing for what she believed would be her final act of vengeance. The ranch belonged to Thomas McKenna, a man she had been tracking for 6 months. McKenna had been a civilian scout for the 7th Cavalry during the massacre, and according to her sources, he had not only participated in the killing but had personally taken scalps as trophies. The Broken Arrow Ranch was a modest spread, consisting of a main house, a barn, a corral, and several outbuildings. It sat in a valley surrounded by low hills, with a creek running through the property, a creek that reminded Aiyana painfully of the one where her people had died. The ranch was isolated, miles from the nearest town, which made it perfect for what she had planned. Aiyana had been watching the ranch for 3 days, learning McKenna's routines, studying his habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had observed that he lived alone, with only occasional visits from a Mexican ranch hand named Carlos, who helped with the cattle. McKenna was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life under the desert sun. What puzzled Aiyana was that McKenna didn't seem to fit the profile of the other men she had killed. The soldiers had been loud, boastful men who drank too much and talked too freely about their exploits. McKenna was quiet, almost solitary, spending his days working with his cattle and his evenings sitting on his porch, staring out at the desert as if he were searching for something he had lost. But Aiyana had learned not to trust appearances. Evo often wore a pleasant mask, and she had seen too much cruelty disguised as kindness to be fooled by a man's quiet demeanor. McKenna had been at Whispering Creek, had participated in the massacre of her people, and for that, he would pay. With his life as the sun reached its zenith, Aiyana began her descent toward the ranch. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of silent movement. Her moccasin feet finding purchase on rocks and sand, without disturbing so much as a pebble. She carried her grandfather's war lance, its obsidian point sharp enough to cut through bone, and her father's hunting knife, its blade worn smooth by generations of use. The plan was simple. She would wait until McKenna was alone, then approach the house under cover of darkness. She would kill him quickly, not out of mercy, but because she had learned that quick deaths were less likely to attract attention. Then she would take his scalp, as he had taken the scalps of her people, and leave it as a warning to others who might think they could murder Apache families without consequence. But as Aiyana reached the bottom of the valley and began to approach the ranch house, something unexpected happened. She heard the sound of crying, not the wailing of an adult, but the soft, heartbroken sobbing of a child. The sound stopped her in her tracks, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. Following the sound, Aiyana crept around the side of the house until she could see into the backyard. What she saw there challenged everything she thought she knew about Thomas McKenna. Sitting on the ground near a small wooden cross was a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with the distinctive features and dark skin that marked her as Apache. The child was placing wildflowers on what was obviously a grave, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words in the Apache language. Aiyana's breath caught in her throat. An Apache child, here at the ranch of a man she had come to kill. It made no sense. If McKenna was the monster she believed him to be, why would he have an Apache child on his property? And why was the child free to move about, to tend to what appeared to be a grave? As Aiyana watched, McKenna emerged from the house carrying a plate of food and a cup of water. But instead of the harsh, commanding voice she expected, he spoke to the child in gentle, broken Apache, clearly struggling with the unfamiliar words, but making the effort nonetheless. "Shima," he said, using the Apache word for little one, "you must eat. Your grandmother would not want you to starve yourself with grief." The child looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of sadness and trust that shocked Aiyana to her core. This was not the look of a captive or a slave. This was the look of a child who felt safe, who felt cared for, who felt loved. "She visits me in my dreams," the child said in Apache, and McKenna nodded as if he understood, though Aiyana could tell he was struggling to follow the words. "Dreams can be a blessing and a curse," McKenna replied in English, then attempted to translate his words into Apache. His pronunciation was terrible, but the child seemed to understand his meaning. Aiyana remained hidden, her mind reeling with confusion. Everything she had believed about Thomas McKenna was being challenged by what she was witnessing. This was not the behavior of a man who had murdered Apache families for sport. This was the behavior of a man who was caring for an Apache child, with genuine tenderness. As she watched, McKenna sat down beside the child and began to eat his own meal, sharing his food and water with her. They ate in comfortable silence, and Aiyana could see that this was a routine they had established, a ritual of shared grief and mutual comfort. "Tell me about your grandmother again," McKenna said in his broken Apache, and the child's face lit up slightly as she began to speak about the woman buried beneath the wooden cross. Aiyana listened as the child told stories about her grandmother's wisdom, her kindness, her skill at weaving baskets and preparing traditional foods. And she watched as McKenna listened with genuine interest, asking questions, encouraging the child to share her memories, helping her to keep her grandmother's spirit alive through storytelling. It was then that Aiyana noticed something that made her blood run cold. Around McKenna's neck, partially hidden beneath his shirt, was a leather cord holding what appeared to be a small pouch in Apache medicine bag. But this was not a trophy taken from a dead enemy. The bag was worn and faded, clearly old, and it was being worn with the respect and reverence that her people showed for sacred objects. That as the afternoon wore on, Aiyana continued to observe, her certainty about McKenna's guilt beginning to crumble. She watched him help the child with her Apache language lessons, teaching her English words while learning Apache words in return. She saw him tend to the grave with the same reverence the child showed, clearly understanding that this was sacred ground. But the most shocking moment came when McKenna began to speak to the child about her family. In his halting Apache, supplemented with English words when his vocabulary failed him, he told her stories about her parents, her uncle, her cousin's, stories that could only have come from someone who had known them personally, who had cared about them, who had mourned their loss. "Your father was a brave man," McKenna said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He died protecting his family, protecting his people. That is the death of a warrior, a death with honor." The child nodded solemnly, and Aiyana could see that these conversations were helping her process her grief, helping her understand her place in the world, helping her maintain her connection to her Apache heritage. As the sun began to set, McKenna and the child went inside the house together. Aiyana remained hidden, her mind churning with questions and doubts. Who was this man? Why did he have an Apache child? How did he know so much about her family? And most importantly, what was his true role in the massacre at Whispering Creek? Night. As Aiyana lay hidden in the rocks above the ranch, she found herself unable to sleep. For 3 years, her hatred had been her strength, her purpose, her reason for living. But now, faced with evidence that challenged her assumptions about Thomas McKenna, she felt that foundation beginning to crack. She thought about the Apache concept of justice, about the balance that had to be maintained. But what if she had been wrong about McKenna? What if killing him would not restore balance but would instead create a new imbalance? What if her quest for vengeance had blinded her to the truth? As dawn approached, Aiyana made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. Instead of killing Thomas McKenna, she would confront him. She would demand answers to her questions, would learn the truth about his role in the massacre, would discover why he was caring for an Apache child with such obvious love and devotion. Apache language might not have had a word for forgiveness, but Aiyana was beginning to understand that there were some things that transcended language, some truths that could only be discovered by setting aside hatred long enough to listen. As the first rays of sunlight painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Aiyana began her descent toward the ranch house. Her weapons still at her side, but her heart opened to possibilities she had never considered. She was about to discover that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in taking a life, but in questioning everything you believe about the person whose life you came to take. Will Aiyana discover the truth about McKenna's past? Don't miss the next chapter to find out how this confrontation changes everything. Like if you believe in the power of truth over vengeance, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Thomas McKenna had been awake since before dawn, as was his habit. At 43 years old, he had learned that sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought memories he preferred to keep, buried in the deepest corners of his mind. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 years, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the desert and trying to find peace in the simple routine of another day. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been his sanctuary for 5 years now, a place where he could live quietly, work with his hands, and try to atone for the sins of his past. It wasn't much, just 640 acres of scrubland with enough water to support a small herd of cattle, but it was his, and more importantly, it was far enough from civilization that he could live without constantly looking over his shoulder. McKenna was not the man he appeared to be. To his few neighbors, he was a quiet rancher who kept to himself, worked hard, and caused no trouble. They knew nothing about his past as a cavalry scout, nothing about the battles he had fought, nothing about the night terrors that still woke him screaming 3 years after he had left the army. They certainly knew nothing about Whispering Creek. Massacre at Whispering Creek was the defining moment of Thomas McKenna's life. The event that had transformed him from a career soldier into a man haunted by guilt and shame. He had been there that September morning in 1881, had witnessed the systematic slaughter of innocent Apache families, had seen Colonel Whitfield's men commit atrocities that violated every code of military honor he had ever believed in. But Mick's role in the massacre was not what most people would have assumed. He had not been one of the killers, he had been one of the few soldiers who had tried to stop it. McKenna had served as a scout for the 7th Cavalry for 8 years, and in that time, he had developed a deep respect for the Apache people. Unlike many of his fellow soldiers, who saw the Apache as savage enemies to be exterminated, McKenna had learned to appreciate their culture, their wisdom, their deep connection to the land. He had learned their language, had studied their customs, had even formed friendships with some of the Apache scouts who worked for the army. When Colonel Whitfield had announced his plan to pacify the Apache band at Whispering Creek, McKenna had assumed it would be a standard military operation: surround the village, demand surrender, and escort the Apache to the reservation. He had not anticipated that Whitfield's true intention was genocide. The attack had begun at dawn, just as the Apache families were beginning their daily routines. McKenna had been positioned on a ridge overlooking the village, serving as a lookout and communications relay. From his vantage point, he had watched in horror as Whitfield's men opened fire on unarmed women and children, had seen them burn lodges, with families still inside, had witnessed them commit acts of brutality that would haunt him for the rest of his life. McKenna had tried to intervene. He had ridden down from his position, shouting orders for the men to cease fire, trying to restore some semblance of military discipline to what had become a massacre. But Whitfield had countermanded his orders, had threatened to have him had made it clear that anyone who interfered with the operation would face severe consequences. Faced with the choice between his military career and his conscience, McKenna had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He had defied Whitfield's orders and had begun trying to save as many Apache lives as possible. Working with a small group of soldiers who shared his horror at what was happening, McKenna had managed to help several Apache families escape the massacre, guiding them to safety in the surrounding hills. But his efforts had come too late for most of the village. By the time the killing stopped, more than 60 Apache men, women, and children were dead, their bodies scattered across the valley like broken dolls. The survivors, fewer than a dozen, had fled into the desert, carrying with them the trauma of what they had witnessed. Among those survivors was a young Apache woman named Aiyana, though McKenna had not known her name at the time. He had seen her during the massacre, crouched behind a boulder, watching her family die. He had tried to reach her to help her escape, but she had vanished into the desert before he could get to her. For 3 years, he had wondered what had become of her, had hoped that she had found safety with other Apache bands, had prayed that she had been able to rebuild her life. What McKenna didn't know was that Aiyana had been watching him during the massacre, had seen him trying to save her people, had witnessed his defiance of Whitfield's orders. But in her grief and trauma, she had not been able to distinguish between the soldiers who were killing her family and the soldiers who were trying to save them. To her, they were all part of the same army, all equally responsible for the destruction of her world. After Whispering Creek, McKenna had been quietly transferred to another unit, his military record showing only that he had been reassigned for administrative reasons. Whitfield had made sure that McKenna's attempts to stop the massacre were not included in the official reports, and the few soldiers who might have supported McKenna's version of events had been scattered to different posts across the territory. McKenna had served out the remainder of his enlistment in a state of growing despair and disillusionment. The army he had served faithfully for 8 years had become something he could no longer recognize, an institution that seemed more interested in political expediency than in honor or justice. When his enlistment ended in 1882, he had left the military and had used his savings to buy the Broken Arrow Ranch, hoping that a life of honest work and solitude would help him find some measure of peace. But peace had remained elusive. The nightmares came regularly, vivid dreams in which he relived the massacre, in which he saw the faces of the Apache families he had failed to save, in which he heard the screams of children who had died while he watched helplessly from his position on the ridge. He had tried drinking to numb the pain, but alcohol only made the dreams worse. He had tried throwing himself into his work, but no amount of physical labor could exhaust his mind enough to stop the memories from surfacing. Turning point had come 6 months ago, when McKenna had discovered an elderly Apache woman dying of exposure near his property line. The woman, whose name was Nalnish, was the grandmother of a young Apache girl named Kaya. They had been traveling through the territory, trying to reach relatives on the reservation, when Nalnish had become too ill to continue. McKenna had brought them both to his ranch, had cared for Nalnish during her final days, and had taken responsibility for Kaya after her grandmother's death. It was not a decision he had made. Lightly harboring Apache refugees was illegal under territorial law, and if the authorities discovered Kaya's presence on his ranch, McKenna could face serious legal consequences. But caring for Kaya had given McKenna something he had not had since Whispering Creek, a sense of purpose. The little girl was traumatized by the loss of her family and her grandmother, and McKenna had found that helping her heal was also helping him heal. Teaching her English while learning Apache from her, sharing meals with her, listening to her stories about her family. These simple acts of human connection had begun to fill the emptiness that had consumed him since the massacre. Kaya had told him about her family, about the massacre that had killed her parents and siblings, about the years she had spent wandering the desert with her grandmother, searching for a place where they could live in safety. Her story was heartbreakingly similar to the stories of the families McKenna had failed to save at Whispering Creek, and caring for her had become his way of trying to atone for his past failures. The medicine bag McKenna wore around his neck had belonged to Kaya's father, a man named Hastian who had been killed in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers 2 years earlier. Kaya had given it to McKenna as a gesture of trust and acceptance, telling him that her father would have wanted him to have it because he was a good man who cared for Apache children. McKenna treasured the medicine bag not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the responsibility he had accepted when he decided to care for Kaya. It represented his commitment to protecting her, to helping her maintain her connection to her Apache heritage, to ensuring that she would never forget where she came from or who she was. This morning, as McKenna sat on his porch watching the sunrise, he was thinking about Kaya's future. She was a bright, resilient child who was learning English quickly while maintaining her fluency in Apache. She was curious about the world beyond the ranch, asking questions about the towns and cities she had never seen, wondering about the white children she had heard about but never met. McKenna knew that he could not keep Kaya isolated on the ranch forever. She needed to learn about both worlds, the Apache world of her birth and the white world she would have to navigate as she grew older. But he also knew that the outside world was not ready for a relationship like theirs, that most people would not understand why a white rancher was caring for an Apache child with such obvious love and devotion. As he pondered these challenges, McKenna noticed movement on the ridge above his ranch. At first he thought it might be a deer or an elk, but as he watched more carefully, he realized that the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful to be an animal. Someone was watching his ranch, and from the way they were moving, it was clear that they were trying to remain hidden. McKenna's military training kicked in immediately. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that whoever was on that ridge was not a casual traveler or a lost prospector. The way they moved, the way they positioned themselves to observe the ranch while remaining concealed, these were the tactics of someone with military or hunting experience. Over the next hour, McKenna continued to observe the ridge while going about his morning routine. He fed his horses, checked on his cattle, and prepared breakfast for himself and Kaya. all while keeping one eye on the mysterious watcher. The person on the ridge was patient, disciplined, and clearly experienced in surveillance qualities that made McKenna increasingly concerned about their intentions. When Kaya emerged from the house for breakfast, McKenna made a decision that probably saved both their lives. Instead of their usual routine of eating on the porch, he suggested that they eat inside, claiming that the morning was too hot to be comfortable outdoors. Kaya accepted this explanation without question, but McKenna could see that she sensed something was wrong. As they ate breakfast in the kitchen, McKenna tried to maintain a normal conversation while his mind raced through possibilities. Who was watching his ranch? And why? Was it someone from his military past, seeking revenge for his role in some long-forgotten conflict? Was it a bounty hunter, tracking Kaya as a runaway Apache? Or was it something else entirely? The answer came sooner than he expected. As McKenna was washing the breakfast dishes, he heard the sound of footsteps on his front porch, not the heavy, booted steps of a cavalry soldier or a bounty hunter, but the soft, careful steps of someone who moved like a ghost through the desert. McKenna motioned for Kaya to stay in the kitchen, then moved quietly to the front window. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Standing on his porch was a young Apache woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with the lean, muscled build of someone who had lived a hard life in the wilderness. She carried traditional Apache weapons, a war lance and a hunting knife, and her eyes held a cold, deadly intensity that McKenna recognized from his years as a soldier. But it was not just her weapons or her demeanor that frightened McKenna. It was the way she was looking at his house, the way she was studying the layout, the way she was clearly preparing for violence. This was not a social visit or a request for help. This was someone who had come to kill. McKenna's mind raced as he tried to understand who this woman was and why she was here. Then, as he studied her face more carefully, recognition dawned. This was the young woman he had seen at Whispering Creek, the one who had crouched behind the boulder watching her family die, the one he had tried to save but who had vanished into the desert before he could reach her. This was Aiyana, and she had come for revenge. The confrontation that will change everything is about to begin. Will McKenna be able to convince Aiyana of the truth? Subscribe to discover how this deadly encounter unfolds. The confrontation began not with violence, but with silence. Aiyana stood on Thomas McKenna's porch, her war lance gripped in her right hand, her father's hunting knife at her belt, staring through the window at the man she had come to kill. McKenna stood inside, separated from her by nothing more than a pane of glass and 3 years of misunderstanding, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether he lived or died. For a long moment, neither moved. Aiyana studied McKenna's face, searching for signs of the cruelty she expected to find, the callousness that would justify what she had come to do. McKenna looked back at her, seeing not just a young Apache woman bent on revenge, but the traumatized girl he had failed to save at Whispering Creek. It was McKenna who broke the silence. Moving slowly, deliberately, he opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, his hands visible and empty. He did not reach for the rifle that hung above his fireplace, did not call for help, did not try to run. Instead, he stood facing Aiyana with the quiet dignity of a man who had been expecting this moment for 3 years. "I know who you are," McKenna said in Apache, his pronunciation careful but clear. "You are Aiyana, daughter of Hastian and Despa, granddaughter of Nolish the Wise. You were at Whispering Creek when your family died." Aiyana's eyes widened in shock. She had not expected McKenna to know her name, her family's names, or to speak her language with such obvious respect for its nuances. For a moment, her certainty wavered, but then her grip tightened on her lance. "You were there too," she replied in English, her voice cold as winter wind. "You were with the soldiers who murdered my family. You watched them die, and did nothing to stop it." McKenna nodded slowly, accepting the accusation without trying to deflect it. "I was there. I was part of the unit that attacked your village. And you are right, I failed to stop what happened. I failed your family, I failed your people, and I have carried that failure with me every day since." This was not the response Aiyana had expected. She had prepared for denials, for excuses, for the kind of self-justification she had heard from other white men when confronted with their crimes. She had not prepared for acknowledgement, for acceptance of responsibility, for what sounded like genuine remorse. "Then you admit your guilt," Aiyana said, raising her lance slightly. "You admit that you deserved to die for what you did." "I admit that I was there," McKenna replied carefully. "I admit that I failed to save your family. But before you take your revenge, I ask you to listen to the whole truth. Not because I deserve mercy, but because your family deserves to have their story told correctly." Aiyana hesitated. In 3 years of hunting the men responsible for the massacre, none of them had offered to tell her anything. They had either denied their involvement entirely or had boasted about their role in what they called a glorious victory over the savages. McKenna's offer to explain was unprecedented, and despite her desire for immediate vengeance, her curiosity was stronger. "Speak," she said, though she did not lower her weapon. "But know that your words will not save you. Nothing you say can bring back my family." McKenna nodded, understanding that he was being given a chance to explain, not to escape. "May I sit?" he asked. "This story will take time to tell properly. Aiyana gestured with her lance toward one of the wooden chairs on the porch. McKenna sat down slowly, keeping his hands visible, while Aiyana remained standing, ready to strike if he made any threatening moves. 3 years ago, McKenna began. I was a scout for the 7th Cavalry Regiment. I had been in the army for 8 years, and I thought I understood what it meant to be a soldier. I thought I was serving my country, protecting settlers, bringing peace to the territory. He paused, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched beyond his ranch. I was wrong about many things, but I was not wrong about the Apache people. In my years as a scout, I had learned to respect your culture, your wisdom, your connection to this land. I had learned your language because I wanted to understand your people, not because I wanted to use that knowledge against you. Aiyana listened, her expression skeptical but attentive. She had heard white men claim to respect her people before, usually just before they tried to cheat them or harm them. When Colonel Whitfield announced the mission to Whispering Creek, McKenna continued, I believed it would be a standard operation. We would surround your village, demand that your people come to the reservation, and escort them there safely. I had participated in such operations before, and while I did not like forcing your people from their ancestral lands, I believed it was better than the alternative of open warfare. McKenna's voice grew heavy with emotion as he continued, but when we reached Whispering Creek, I realized that Whitfield had lied to me and to most of the other soldiers. This was not a relocation mission. This was an extermination mission. Whitfield intended to kill everyone in your village, men, women, children. Elderson claimed that they had resisted arrest. Aiyana's grip on her lance tightened. And you went along with it? No, McKenna said firmly. I tried to stop it. When the shooting started, I rode down from my position on the ridge, shouting orders for the men to cease fire. I tried to restore military discipline, to turn the massacre back into a proper military operation. But Whitfield countermanded my orders. He threatened to have me court-martialed for insubordination if I interfered with his pacification of the village. McKenna stood up slowly, moving to the edge of the porch where he could see the ridge where Aiyana had been hiding. I saw you that morning, he said quietly. You were crouched behind a boulder, watching your family die. I tried to reach you, to help you escape, but you vanished before I could get to you. Aiyana stared at him, her mind reeling. She remembered that morning with perfect clarity, remembered the chaos and terror, remembered seeing soldiers everywhere, but she also remembered something else, a soldier on horseback, riding toward her position, shouting something she couldn't understand over the gunfire. You, she whispered. You were the one who was riding toward me. McKenna nodded. I was trying to save as many people as possible. I managed to help several families escape into the hills, but it was too little, too late. By the time I could act, most of your people were already dead. Aiyana lowered her lance slightly, confusion replacing certainty in her eyes. But you were part of the army. You were part of the force that attacked us. Yes, McKenna admitted. I was part of the army, and I bear responsibility for that. But I was not part of the massacre. When I realized what Whitfield intended, I chose to defy him, to risk my career and my life to save as many of your people as I could. McKenna reached slowly into his shirt, moving carefully so as not to alarm Aiyana. He pulled out the medicine bag that hung around his neck, holding it so she could see it clearly. This belonged to Hasty and Kaya's father, he said. She gave it to me 6 months ago, when I took her in after her grandmother died. She said her father would have wanted me to have it because I was a good man who cared for Apache children. I stared at the medicine bag, recognizing the distinctive beadwork and leather craftsmanship. Kaya Hastian's daughter. She is here. She is inside, McKenna said. She has been living with me since her grandmother passed away. I have been caring for her, teaching her English while she teaches me Apache, helping her maintain her connection to your people's traditions. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Kaya appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices speaking in Apache. When she saw Aiyana, her eyes widened with recognition and joy. Aiyana, Kaya exclaimed, running toward the young woman. I thought you were dead. Grandmother told me stories about you, about how brave you were, about how you survived when so many others did not. Aiyana knelt down to embrace the child, her weapons forgotten for the moment. Little one, she said softly, I thought I was the only one left. There are others, Kaya said excitedly. Not many, but some. They live in the deep desert, moving from place to place, trying to stay free. But I live here now with Thomas. He takes care of me, teaches me things, helps me remember our people's ways. Aiyana looked up at McKenna, who was watching the reunion with obvious emotion. You care for her? I try to, McKenna replied. She has taught me more than I have taught her. Caring for her has helped me understand what I should have been fighting for all along, not territory or military glory, but the protection of families, the preservation of what is good and innocent in this world. Aiyana stood slowly, her mind struggling to process this new information. Everything she had believed about Thomas McKenna was being challenged by what she was seeing and hearing. This was not the behavior of a man who had participated in genocide. This was the behavior of a man who was trying to atone for his failures, who was dedicating his life to protecting the very people he had failed to save. Why? Aiyana asked. Why do you care for her? Why risk your safety for an Apache child? McKenna was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Because 3 years ago, I failed to save your family. I failed to save dozens of other families. I have lived with that failure every day since, knowing that I could have done more, should have done more. Caring for Kaya doesn't erase that failure, but it gives me a chance to honor the memory of those who died by protecting one who lived. He paused, looking directly into Aiyana's eyes. And because she reminds me every day of why I became a soldier. In the first place, not to kill, but to protect. Not to destroy families, but to preserve them. Aiyana felt something inside her chest beginning to crack the hard shell of hatred that had protected her heart for 3 years. She had come here expecting to find a monster, but instead, she had found a man who was carrying his own burden of guilt and grief, who was trying to make amends in the only way he knew how. The other soldiers, Aiyana said, the ones who laughed. While they killed, what happened to them? McKenna's expression darkened. Some of them are dead. I heard that several were killed by an Apache woman who hunted them down one by one. The newspapers called her the ghost of the desert. Aiyana nodded grimly. 7 of them. I killed 7 of the men who were at Whispering Creek. And the others, scattered 2 different posts, different territories. Some left the army, some were promoted. Colonel Whitfield was transferred to a desk job in Washington, where he could do no more harm to your people. McKenna studied Aiyana's face, seeing the pain and exhaustion that lay beneath her anger. You have been hunting them for 3 years, living for revenge, carrying hatred like a weapon. But what happens when all the guilty men are dead? What happens when your revenge is complete? Aiyana had never considered this question. For 3 years, her entire existence had been focused on tracking down and killing the men responsible for the massacre. She had never thought about what she would do afterward, had never imagined a life beyond vengeance. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Kaya asked me the same question about my guilt, McKenna said. She asked me what I would do when I had atoned enough, when I had done enough good to balance the evil I had failed to prevent. I told her I didn't know either. Kaya, who had been listening to this conversation with the solemn attention of a child who had experienced too much tragedy, spoke up. Grandmother used to say that hatred is like carrying a burning coal in your hand, hoping to throw it at someone else, but you are the one who gets burned. Both adults looked at the child, struck by the wisdom in her words. Aiyana felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, the first tears she had shed since the day her family died. I came here to kill you, Aiyana said to McKenna. I have been planning your death for months. I know, McKenna replied. And I would not have stopped you. If my death would have brought you peace, if it would have honored your family's memory, I would have accepted it. But it wouldn't have, would it? Aiyana said, the realization dawning on her. Killing you wouldn't bring them back. It wouldn't heal the wound in my heart. It would just create another death, another tragedy, another reason for someone else to seek revenge. McKenna nodded. Revenge is a cycle that never ends. Someone kills, so someone else kills in return. And on, until everyone is dead and no one remembers what started the killing in the first place. Aiyana looked at Kaya, seeing in the child's eyes a hope and innocence that she had thought were lost forever. Here was an Apache child who was learning to live in both worlds, who was maintaining her connection to her heritage while also preparing for a future that would require her to navigate the white world. What would you have me do? Aiyana asked. If not revenge, then what? Liv, McKenna said simply. Help me raise Kaya, teach her the things about your people that I cannot teach her. Help her grow up strong and proud of who she is. Help me understand how to honor your people's memory, not through death, but through life. Aiyana looked at her weapons, at the lance and knife that had been her companions for 3 years of hunting and killing. Slowly, deliberately, she set them down on the porch. The Apache language has no word for forgiveness, she said, but perhaps we don't need words. Perhaps we can speak it with our actions, as you have been doing. McKenna nodded, understanding that this was not forgiveness in the traditional sense, but something deeper, a choice to break the cycle of violence, to choose healing over hatred, to honor the dead by protecting the living. There is something else, Aiyana said. Other survivors from Whispering Creek, other Apache families who are hiding in the desert, afraid to trust anyone. If they knew there was a safe place, a place where Apache children could learn and grow, this ranch could be that place. McKenna said it's isolated, defensible, and I have enough land to support more people, but it would be dangerous. If the authorities discovered what we were doing, everything worthwhile is dangerous, Aiyana replied. But some things are worth the risk. Kaya clapped her hands together, her face bright with excitement. You're going to stay. You're going to help Thomas take care of the other children. Aiyana knelt down and hugged the little girl. Yes, little one, I'm going to stay. We're going to build something new here, something that honors our ancestors while preparing for the future. As the sun reached its zenith over the Arizona desert, 3 unlikely companions sat on the porch of the Broken Arrow Ranch, planning a future that none of them could have imagined just hours before. The Apache girl who had carried hatred like a shield had learned to set it down. The lonely rancher who had carried guilt like a stone had found a way to transform it into purpose. And a little Apache child had helped to wounded adults discover that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in fighting your enemies, but in learning to trust them. The Apache language might not have had a word for forgiveness, but on that day, in that place, 3 people discovered that some truths transcend language. and that the most powerful words are often the ones that are never spoken aloud, but are lived out through actions of compassion, understanding, and hope. A story of healing that transcends hatred. Like if you believe in the power of understanding over vengeance, subscribe for more incredible tales of human connection, and share to spread the message that love can triumph over the deepest wounds. Legal notice: this story is completely fictional and has been created solely for entertainment purposes. The characters, events, and situations described are products of imagination and do not represent real facts. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental.